Good afternoon and welcome to yet another installment of Document in Transition. I am Michael Gordon. I am joined today by first Mr. Joseph Hamilton and Marcia Nadir Sharma. I welcome you both to today's program.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Michael, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Marcia and viewers. Good afternoon.
Okay, let's get right to the meat of the matter. We're essentially hours away, a couple of hours away from a very critical ruling by the Caribbean Court of Justice. Notwithstanding that, I must say for the record that notwithstanding the ruling of the CCJ, the issue of elections 2020 goes back to the hands of the Guyana Elections Commission. Having said that, I believe strategically timed is a notice requesting a meeting by the ABC diplomatic community and this morning they met with the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dr. Karen Cummings. One of the headlines coming out of that meeting is a warning by the diplomatic community that any declaration, there are consequences for any declaration not made utilizing the figures coming out of the national recount. Marcia, I'm going to begin with you. Your reflection on such a intricately timed meeting.
Nice choice of words there, Michael. Intricately timed, and I would agree with you from the perspective that the timing of this announcement and this statement really and truly is to connote to the world and to all Guyanese that irrespective of what is the outcome at the CCJ today, the realities are that the only measure, the only basis for which the declaration for the elections 2020 and the formation of a new government can only be based on the on the national recount figures, which we already know to be validly declared votes, which was the recount process was a consequence of two fraudulent attempts by Mr. Claremont Mingo to essentially rig and steal an entire election for the APNU-AFC. The blatant and obvious attempt resulted in, as we all know, no amount of attempts to rewrite history by His Excellency in the Washington Post or anywhere else for that matter will change the fact that the national recount occurred as a result of what was glaringly overt attempts to rig and steal the elections with fraudulent numbers. And the national recount, as supported by the CARICOM Observer Team, and its report essentially says that, look, the national recount is credible and acceptable enough in its present format and in the quantitative characteristic that it is to declare the elections for 2020 in favor of the PPC.
Joe, you have historically you have voiced some very strong views, not only as it relates to the consistency of this particular call by the diplomatic community, but the posture and pontification of the APNU-AFC.
I saw a report, I think it's Chicanery this morning, reporting on article out of the Washington Post, where there was an interview with David Granger. And Granger was so brazen and bold to perpetuate lies that everybody knows is a lie. When he said to the interviewer that the recount came about because of discrepancies and allegations of irregularities from the coalition. I mean, how can you be such a sick, brazen, pathetic liar when the world is aware how the recount came about, when you signed on to the recount I mean, how do you say that and expect people to take you seriously? And what it is showing, Michael, is that how unworthy David Granger is to ever have ascended to the presidency in this country. And the people of Guyana knew best that they just kicked him out of office. Because as Marcia has indicated in her opening comments, every observer mission, every country, every diplomatic community, every observer, local and international, they're aware how this recount started. And Marcia has explained that the recount was to finally put to rest the contestation about the election results based on two fraudulent declarations coming from conspirators within the Guyana Elections Commission. And Granger signed on to this in the presence of 5 prime ministers of the CARICOM, including at the time the then chairperson and the incoming chairperson. How can this man, you know, how does one like that speak to your children to talk to them about good and bad and righteousness and doing what is right? How do you look at yourself when you brazenly can say that to the world when everyone else knows differently? I mean, it is so sickening. And that is what it is. And so we're at a place where I have said and continue to say, and Marcia has already said that, whatever happens this afternoon at the CCJ, in my view, has no bearing on the declaration of the results. The declaration of the...
Joe, I'm going to ask you a bit in a short while about post-CCJ ruling. But I'm also, what I found to be very interesting is the demand by the diplomatic community, the ABCE countries, to solicit such a meeting with the government of Guyana in just on the heels of the Granger statements in the Washington Post. It's
because listen, people are angry, and as much as they try to be diplomatic and use diplomatic terms, they are calling this charlatan and Pharisee out for what he is. Because everyone thought, even at the late hour, when he said that I will abide by the recount that I signed on to, that is what he meant. And therefore, to come now, when everyone thought we could have moved on, that to come now to attempt to obfuscate the real issue and to try to con, and that is what it is, think he can run a con game on the diplomatic community and the international community, it is so pathetic. It is really psychotic, because you have to be a sociopath to believe that you can get past the whole world. You cannot be in your senses to attempt to believe that. And so everyone know what the tabulation from the recount, what they are. PPP garnering over 233,000 votes, 15,000 votes more than the APNU-AFC coalition. And no one is going back to the recount. We are talking about declaration based on the recount tabulation, and that is the expectation of the world. Any other thing, the world will come down severely and condignly on Granger and his cabal. And basically that is what, in my view, the diplomatic community, they could have issued a statement. But they did not do that this morning, as you have suggested, and I've read the reports coming out of that. They sought to, even the de facto case and the squatting case, summon an executive of this government and to put before her. So you cannot anymore misinterpret, because a statement could have had interpretation and misinterpretation. So they wanted to go. I am sure also, I am sure they might have even asked for a meeting with David Granger. And he sent Karen Cummings. But the point is, they want to be clear, looking her in her eyes, and to say, listen, woman, you all could continue your foolish little game. But if you continue this foolish little game and you attempt to install yourself without winning these elections, the consequences will be severe. So she cannot now seek to misinterpret what they would have said via a press statement. If you recall, Michael, they were issuing press statements all along. Today, because everyone's expectation is, since the CCJ is finished at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, whatever time, the expectation of the world is GCOM calling an emergency meeting to declare the winner of these elections. That is the expectation. And therefore, the diplomatic community is saying to Granger and his cabal, listen, this is what our expectation is. A declaration from the recount results and nothing else. Any other thing else. This government and the cabal and the country, by extension, is in for a serious times going forward. That is how I see this meeting that was called to speak to Karen Cummings on behalf of Granger and his cabal, so that she cannot misinterpret their statements.
But just to add a bit to what Joe said, it wouldn't even be a question of an emergency meeting of the commission. The reality is, irrespective of what the CCJ rules today, the Guyana Elections Commission, the commission of the Guyana Elections Commission, essentially has to meet in order to make a final declaration with respect to the elections. Now, if we take a little bit of a step back, in the last essentially 4 months, we have been speaking relentlessly on the powers of the commission. And there was, I can't remember where I read it, but there was a nice historical background given as to the whole provision of Article 162 and empowering the commission to make the decision on the advice of the CEO. And for a bit of enlightenment for our viewers, essentially, prior to the constitutional amendments and amendments in the laws to allow for the entire commission to sit and meet on this issue, that amendment to allow or to empower the commission to do all acts that are necessary to ensure fair, impartial, and compliance by any officer of the Guyana Elections Commission to the instructions of the commission, who has supervision and control over those officers. And in this case, for example, would be Mr. Lowenfield.
Marcia, it's an issue I wanted to ask you about. And I know I'm going to take you somewhat into the realm of speculation. Let's assume, and for all intents and purposes, Kit Lowenfield seems intent on not doing the right thing. Let's assume that he continues to defy the instruction of the commission. Where do we go from here? What is the provision in law to cater to scenario?
Well, so as I was explaining, the whole point of the amendment was to actually give the commission the authority to do all acts and to make all necessary instructions to whomever they deem worthy or necessary to complete whatever functions need to be performed in order to see a finality to the elections 2020. And in this case, Mr. Lowenfield had a very clear instruction to produce the declarations consistent using the national recount figures as the basis for his declarations, which would have enabled the commission to make the necessary declaration it needed to do. He failed to do that. He did something contrary. He said, you have to act on my advice. We've seen the APNU-AFC go on a massive campaign saying that he must on the commission, and in this case, obviously, it will rest squarely in the decisive vote will rest clearly in the hands of retired Justice Claudette Singh, given that she essentially is the deciding factor in a three-man race, essentially, right, at the commission. And Mr. Lowenfield, supported by the APNU-AFC, has basically taken the posture, you can only do what I tell you to do. And that's absolute nonsense. It flies contrary to the Constitution. A conduct that we have grown very accustomed to when it comes to the APNU-AFC, using the Constitution and its application only when it's convenient and when it serves their purposes. But all of a sudden, when they have to comply with it to the full letter and strength of the law, you know, the issue of, oh, we're not so sure about the interpretation, let's go to court, as was done in the present case. But what has to happen, and as Senior Counsel Ralph Ramkaran eloquently wrote about this weekend in the papers, with whether he complies or he doesn't comply, the commission made up of Justice Claudette Singh, the three government appointed and the three opposition appointed commissioners, have the power to say, okay, this is not, you have not conducted yourself or carried out the instructions we have given to you. You go back and fix it and do as I tell you to do. Okay, and I would like to also point out that we have seen over the last 3 weeks snippets of Mr. Alexander saying, oh, because of me in 2011, I was able to champion the incorrect pronouncement of a declaration. And it was on my word that the then chief elections officer had to go back and fix it because I found out that there was a problem. In the same token, that applies here. If Mr. Lowenfield does not do as he's supposed to do, the commission can say, you go back and bring back what I tell you to do. And if you don't do it, well, they have clear ambit, clear power on the Article 162 to do all acts that are necessary, any and all acts necessary to ensure that there's fair, impartial, and compliance with the laws for the completion of these elections.
Well, my thing is that one would expect some semblance of consistency on the part of Vincent Alexander. Joe, the APNU-AFC, and by extension their agent, Keith Lowenfield, would much prefer a scenario of the tail wagging the dog, don't you think?
No, Michael, listen. Lowenfield is a creature of the commission. And I would go further to say...
But the servant of APNU-AFC, seemingly.
Yes, but I'm saying, before there was a chief executive officer, chief elections officer, there was a commission. And therefore, he's a creature of the commission, like all the other deputies and assistants and whoever else man the secretariat. And I will go further to say, Lowenfield is a utensil of the commission that can be disposed of. So that's the fundamental issue here. I mean, Marcia can speak to the law. I'm a student of management. No way a CEO can thump his nose on the board of directors of a company. That is why it's a simple matter. No protocol, no rules of engagement, no labor law allow for. I'm taking it out of the realm of law and legality. I'm talking about any company. The CEO, he served at the behest of the board of directors.
But that's law too, Joe.
To execute their instructions, he need to be dismissed. He need to be fired. Because you can't have a situation whereby somebody think that they can usurp the authority and the function of, in this case, GCOM, a constitutional independent body. And you have an employee, more so, an employee that is on a 3-year contract.
A statutory employee.
You understand that? He attempted to lie through his teeth, but he's a constitutional office holder.
No, not constitutional.
He's a statutory office holder that is on a contract at the moment. And that contract can be terminated at any time for dereliction of duty and all the other things. So I am at a place whereby Lowenfield or no Lowenfield, there has to be a declaration. That is the point. Because an election got 3 phases. 1, preparation for the election, list and all the other things, ballots. 2, a voting day for people to cast their votes. And the conclusion of an election is a declaration of the votes gathered by the contesting parties. Election is not over unless and until there's a declaration. So nowhere in my scheme of things, I see Lowenfield trying to stand in the way of the commission, as Marcia has outlined and as Ralph Ramkoran has said. The commission has a task and a duty under the Constitution to execute. And they must execute it, they have to execute it. And so for me, I don't bother too much with Lowenfield because Lowenfield can be replaced. And if Myers don't want to execute the function, she can be replaced. And the commission is empowered to appoint a chief elections officer, in my view.
But if I can add to what Joe is saying, this is even a little bit more serious than just simply an employee not complying with the instructions of their board, because Mr. Lowenfield is in a very peculiar situation where, as a statutory officer, he has to perform a public duty. He has a public responsibility to ensure that not only does he comply with the law and do the instructions or comply with the instructions given to him by the commission, the constitutional body, he is also essentially the person who will bear the brunt and burden of a breach or failure to carry out or perform a public duty, as we have seen in the private criminal cases filed against him. This is not a simple case of just firing a person because he didn't obey the board of directors. This has graver consequences, and the graver consequences are essentially, if you're found guilty by a court of law, that to have essentially failed and or breached and or intentionally executed your public duty in a fraudulent manner, carries a life sentence with it. And so this is not just an ordinary, oh, I don't feel like complying with my boss, so I will do as I please. This has this action that he purports to do not once, or who did not once, but twice so far, and we can reasonably speculate he will probably do it again for a 3rd time, is essentially a blatant, brazen act of saying, look, I don't care what anybody says. I don't care what the law says. And it also signals that he's prepared to bear the consequences of his actions. Now, I say this too, against the backdrop that you have a lot of persons egging him on. I mean, we saw a whole full-page article in the Chronicle, oh, we got your back, okay? It's very easy for somebody to tell another person who is breaking the law, I got your back. But when it's time to pay the piper and you got to stand up and take your punishment, none of them ain't coming to stand with you. Is you alone facing the brunt of your actions, because it would have been you who acted or failed to act. And in this case, acted. My mother and father have a very basic saying. Once is a mistake, twice is willful, and 3 times, man, look. And this is an apt proverb to apply to Mr. Lowenfield's conduct in for the last essentially year and a half, because this thing started essentially since the no confidence motion, when he did everything in his power to prolong the holding of elections. Now that we had the elections, he's done everything in his power now to prevent the proper declaration of the PPC consistent with not only the actual results of the statement opposed on March 2nd, but the national recount too. So he needs to seriously step back and take a good look at what are the ramifications and consequences of his actions, and understand that nobody ain't coming and stand up with him in the prisoner's dock when he got to stand up and answer these charges.
Importantly to remind viewers, Lowenfield has already submitted to GCOM the recount tabulation. He has already done that based on the 10 recount tabulation of the 10 districts. And that is how we know that the recount spoke to 460,000 votes, valid votes cast, of which the PPP got 233,000 and odd, and APNU-AFC got 217,000 and odd. So he has already done that. That is already with the commissioners. He attached to that at that time a statistical fiction that he himself couldn't rely on, because his new report did not utilize the statistical fiction, because that statistical fiction gave APNU-AFC a 2/3 majority in the National Assembly and had them winning Barbados of all places. So this liar, this conspirator could not even depend on the statistical fiction. What the final report is, viewers must understand. The final report, the principal matter in the final report is basically extrapolating and informing the commission that based on the numbers I gave you earlier of votes the party garnered, these are the seats to be allocated to the parties in the National Assembly, and these are the seats to be allocated to the parties at the Regional Democratic Council. So that is what, it's not a new number to bring. He has already submitted to the Elections Commission the number, which is 460,000 votes cast.
You know, I wanna say something here, and it's a little off topic though, Michael and Joe, but you see, there continues to be this debate about valid votes, and I guess our position may not be clear. Persons don't want to accept the position, or don't want to, or they probably just genuinely don't understand what we're talking about. The 460,352 votes counted at the national recount are all valid votes. They're not invalid votes, they are valid votes. And the validity of those votes were ascertained when we opened each one of those 2,339 boxes, and we checked each and every single ballot to see, one, if it had the official stamp, which would in this case be the 6-digit stamp or an intent to stamp, and two, if there was a clear indication next to a list, a single list that a person wanted to vote for. So what people need to understand, and if they have forgotten, be reminded, 460,352 ballots were determined and are valid votes in consistent with the provisions of the Representation of the People's Act. There is no, I heard there was a propaganda piece where I think Mr. Norton was suggesting that once the recount is done, now we must engage in a verification of the votes. That is absolute nonsense. That is not in the law. That is a fabrication, a misinterpretation, and a gross and irresponsible act by Mr. Norton and anybody else who propagates such nonsense. The realities and the truth of the matter is 460,352 ballots were valid votes cast, of which 233,000 plus were allocated and or given for and in favor of the list known as the People's Progressive Party Civic. So please, let us understand this issue once and for all. We are not talking about invalid votes here. All of the ballots counted at the national recount were valid votes.
No, but Marcy, also, the same report would have had how many invalid votes?
With that too.
And that is about 5,000 or thereabout. So the report set out total amount of votes cast. That is what the report will say. And of the total amount of votes cast in the district, these are the amount of valid votes, and these are the amount of invalid votes to make the total. So we already separate sheep from goat. There is no confusion. It is these liars trying to create a confusion. The report before GCOM, I repeat, with the 460,000 valid votes, also captured nearly 5,000 invalid votes. So there's no question. You can't go back again to look for the quality of the vote. That is already determined. First, it was determined at the presiding officers doing the count after the elections was concluded. And at the recount, it was reaffirmed what the invalid votes are and what the valid votes are. And therefore, there is no third place. So what Norton is attempting for us to do, a recount of the recount. The law don't even allow for that. The recount has happened. And therefore, we have 10 authenticated certificates by GCOM coordinators who is akin to people like Mingo. That is what they did at the recount, where they created a position called coordinator, which is akin to the registration officer of the district, and they signed off.
But Joe, that is even irrelevant at this time, only from the perspective of this. Well, sorry, I shouldn't put it that way, but you know what I mean. What I'm trying to say is that there, as part of, to supplement what you were saying, there has been a narrative that the CARICOM report is not to be used because they only witnessed 18% of the count. Well, newsflash, Guyana, Mr. Lowenfield did not sit in any of the recount stations for a single entire box to be counted. He was present 0%.
Notwithstanding that point, Marcy, I think it has been established, and we all know what is humanly possible in a scenario where there's a particular amount of recount station. One isn't omnipresent. Notwithstanding that, we have moved beyond the issue of the recount. As far as we are concerned, those certificates speak for themselves. From your own legal, and I want to pick your thoughts from your own legal perspective. Over the weekend and in the early part of the week, and this is in closing, we have seen ugly, vulgar attacks on the Caribbean Court of Justice. And these are distinguished gentlemen and ladies who have served on the Caribbean Court of Justice. And to see the vulgarity and the nakedness of these attacks, one is taken aback, especially from a perspective of being Guyanese, because they're being attacked more so by Guyanese.
As an officer of the court, I personally am very ashamed and embarrassed by the behavior of our Guyanese or persons. I can't even say Guyanese because it's not a majority. It's just a one-sided perspective. But I need to say, as an officer of the court and as a Guyanese, I need to lend my voice to the words of the Bar Association, who have come out and spoken out against the vile attacks. I have to give my words and lend my support, my voice and support, not only to our local bar association, but we need to understand that esteemed practitioners throughout the region, including Sina Jairam of Trinidad, Senior Counsel of Trinidad, and other institutions have really taken a grave offense to what has been a very malicious and really a tragedy and an attack on the CCJ. Now we saw it happening to Honorable Prime Minister Motley, then we saw it happen to Prime Minister Gonzalez, and so it's a pattern of behavior. Anybody who does not agree with the APNU-AFC, who does not subscribe to the narrative that they won even though they did not win, are susceptible to attacks, and it's very irresponsible and highly childish on their part. For one, I mean, I need to make it as simple as that. Very childish, because here you have these esteemed gentlemen, and it's not even the CCJ themselves that are being attacked, the judges of the CCJ, but even now Mr. Duku, who is a part of the Board of Trustees, and so the collateral damage, the willful and wanton collateral damage that is happening because the APNU and AFC do not want to accept that they are engaging in fraud and that they are trying to steal an election. They have rigged the elections, and they are trying very hard, and the world is saying, no, hold up. Is something not to be proud of, as no Guyanese, none, not even their supporters should be proud to hold up those placards and to continue this vile and onslaught, because it really demonstrates the level of childishness on their part. And I lend my support and my voice to all of the organizations and persons who have come out repeatedly, not just in favor of the independence and the integrity of the institution called the Caribbean Court of Justice, but to anybody who has stood up for the fight against democracy, or the fight to undermine democracy, I should say.
Joe, our legal colleague has eloquently spoken about individuals being susceptible to attacks, and these eloquent words, I refer to it as in closing. Your closing thoughts, I refer to it as a good old-fashioned APNU-AFC cost down.
No, the behavior of Granger and his cabal is akin to how the mafia operates. So Granger is a mob boss. That is how gangsters operate. They try to intimidate courts and judges. That is what it is. They're not diplomacy. This is not politics anymore. There's a set of people behaving like gangsters, attempting to intimidate the apex court of our country. And so Granger is not a sanctimonious gangster anymore. He's a full-out gangster. There's nothing sanctimonious about this behavior. This is gangster behavior. You take it, you know, in politics, with all its rough and tumble, there is some decency, there is some protocol, there is some bridges we don't cross. There are some things that we determine we don't do, we will not do. But when you see these people, all of that is thrown out the window. And therefore, it's not a political institution anymore. It is a set of gangsters, and they're behaving that way. Gangsters and gangstresses, because the females, in some instances, they're more rabid than the males. So that is why you have Nagamoto, Ramjatan, Arman, Norton, all of them are gangsters who are trying to intimidate a court, thinking that they can bring their threats and their intimidation can determine how the court will rule, one way or the other. For us, the court ruling is to settle a legal question. That is what it is. It is not to make a determination, in my view, about who won these elections. We know who won the elections. Mm-hmm. The elections was won by the People's Progressive Party Civic, whose list of candidates had at the head of it the presidential candidate Irfan Ali. And therefore, the moment the tabulation was finished and the recount was finished, and Lowenfield submitted that recount tabulation to Guyana Elections Commission, Irfan Ali is deemed to be president. It is just the legal formalities to conclude the matters. Any other thing that happened, and not that, the world would come down like tons of bricks on Granger and this cabal that he has. So that is where we're at in this country. And for those who think that this is some jokey, funny business, Granger, in the scheme of things, is a wannabe dictators. The world has had to deal with dictators who had armies of tens of thousands and fighter jets. And one come to mind. He was found in a hole hiding Saddam Hussein. Just not so long ago, Bashir in Sudan. And we can go on and on. So Granger is a wannabe little dictator. The diplomatic community, over the period of decades, they have dealt with dictators. And they know how to deal with governments that don't have legitimacy. Governments who are trying to implant themselves without having the will of the people decide. And so that is how I see this developing. So we expect that after the CCJ ruling, GCOM will convene urgently a meeting to make the final declaration based on the recount results. And that is what the world is calling for. That is what every organization, every member of the diplomatic community, and every observer mission that reviewed these elections. And that is what will be. Any other thing will be tragic and terrible for this country we call Guyana.
Marcia, your closing thoughts.
I can't add more to what Joe said, but just to remind everyone and to the previous statements that I just made, there is a reason why there is an independence in the arms of government. The judiciary has its independence to essentially be a check and balance on the actions of the executive. And I often ask myself, what would have happened to the Court of Appeal judges if they had not ruled in favor of the APNU-AFC as it did this time around? I mean, would they have been the recipients of vile attacks as the CCJ has been receiving, or the judges of the CCJ? So as Guyanese, we need to take responsibility for our actions. We need to understand that our words and our conduct have far-reaching consequences to ensuring that our democracy is sustained, and also to ensure that we are taken as serious players on the world stage. And we cannot continue in this belligerent kind of behavior where everyone who says contrary to our will, the schoolyard bully attitude comes out, and then you stamp your feet in a tantrum and say, oh, no, it's my turn, that's not going to work here. And I really, again, like every time I come on your program, I call on the leaders of the APNU-AFC to call upon your supporters and literally find it within yourself to do what is the right thing, the responsible thing. Think about the longevity and the future of your party and the persons coming behind you, because your actions today have far-reaching consequences in the future. And to all of our supporters and the viewers out there, we'll say that the PPC continues to fight for democracy, and this will not end. We look to the Commission to do what is right and comply with the law and the letter and spirit of the law. And just hold tight, everybody. Stay hopeful, and we are here in the struggle.
Marcia, Nadir, Sharma, and Joseph Hamilton, thank you both for being a part of this program.
Hi, Michael. Have a good afternoon. Marcia,
thank you.
Have a good afternoon, and the viewers.
Thank you, everyone. Same to you, Joe.
I thank you for watching and listening to this program. I'm Michael Gordon. Join my colleague Edward Lane at 8 p.m. for yet another installment of Government in Transition, as we await the CCJ ruling at 3 p.m., just over an hour from now.